Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to IST 2021. My name is Jonathan Köhler, and I'm going to be moderating our first keynote presentation of the conference. I would like very much to welcome Mónica Ramos Mejía for this afternoon's presentation. She is an assistant professor in the School of Management at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, Bogotá, in Colombia. Hope the pronunciation is not too bad. And she has an Innovation and Governance PhD from University of Twente on transitions and grassroots ecopreneurs. Before I ask her to present, we've got a couple of household and organizational points. Firstly, I would also like to welcome Heiko Steiber. He is going to be accompanying us through our presentation artistically for the next couple of days, and we'll see the results of his work on Friday. So welcome, Heiko. We're really excited to have you here, and we'll see what comes up. And as to the organization of this afternoon's session, what we're going to do is we're going to have Mónica talking. While she's talking, you can put questions in the chat, which you can see on your screens. And when she's finished her presentation, then we'll go have a question and answer session and go through those questions. Okay, so with that, I would like to give the floor to Mónica. Take it away, and I'm excited to hear your talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for this warm welcoming. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Katarina, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share my ideas, which hopefully will be provoking in relation to sustainability transitions in the Global South. The presentation I've prepared for today has 4 parts. So first, I would like to make clear what I mean when I talk about the Global South. And then I would like to discuss what it means for sustainability transitions research in the Global South. And then the third part, I would like to share my ideas about the main topic of the conference. So I would like to reflect about what mainstreaming would mean for the developing South, and I would like also to discuss what impact would mean for the Global South. And finally, we'll have around 40 minutes for comments and questions. So I really look forward to your reactions. Okay, so because the Global South is such a contested concept, and we are never happy about using these words, the Global South. I would like to say what I will mean here in this presentation when I talk about the Global South. So first, I refer to regions with colonial histories. And in the image, you can see the Opera House in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon jungle, which is quite paradoxical. So colonial histories mean Western institutions that were imposed on non-Western societies with very different cultures and social ways of organizing. And because of this, in the Global South, we also find diverse worldviews. These are alternative ways of understanding what the human being is, what their relationship is with nature and with other beings, what life is about. So it means, in the end, alternative ways of organizing society. And these alternative worldviews, coexist with the Western worldview in a continuum from resistance to being at the margins. And finally, another important characteristic of the Global South is that we have regions where a significant portion of the population lack access to proper basic services in all domains: food, housing, mobility, recreation, education, health, and so on. And what is lying underneath this characteristic, what we find underneath this colonial histories, alternative worldviews, and large groups of people that are left behind. Well, basically, I would refer to two dimensions, I would say. One is the institutional context, which is extremely complex in the Global South. What does this complexity mean about? It means that there's a mixture of formal and informal institutions, and both, either formal or informal, can function well or can not function well in relation to the expansion of human capabilities. So when I talk about ill-functioning institutions, I talk about institutions that create capability deprivation. And when I talk about well-functioning institutions, I refer to institutions that foster the ability of human beings to lead their lives they have reason to value and to enhance the substantive choices they have. And this is following Amartya Sen's capabilities ideas. So as a result, we have that states, for instance, are weak and sometimes illegitimate and are hardly differentiated from other power systems. Usually, these states are co-opted by elites. So, for example, in Colombia, 20 years ago, paramilitary groups could decide who the local government was going to be, and for the rest of the government, they were going to be benefited from this government. So in this case, it was armed groups who were the elites, but it can also happen with economic elites who define or who decide who is going to be in power. What this creates is that in the end, we have very little counterbalance in power systems. So as a result, in the Global South, we find a context of market imperfection, clientelist and social exclusive communities, patriarchal households, and patrimonial or marketized states. So that's one of the things that is lying behind the characteristics I mentioned before. And the other dimension, I would say, that is really important is the epistemic diversity. So in the Global South, because we find diverse worldviews, we find alternative ontologies and epistemologies which imply diverse ways of knowing, organizing, relating, and so on. And these diverse worldviews are a challenge to modern ontologies and epistemologies, but also challenge the modern ontologies and epistemologies, despite the globalization force that creates a one-world world. So, what does it mean for sustainability transitions research? I've already talked about this complex institutional context and the epistemic diversity. So what does it mean for sustainability transitions research? So basically, we find in our countries socio-technical configurations that privilege Western, modern, developed models that coexist with alternative socio-technical configurations. In the end, what we find are hybrid socio-technical systems, not stable, that evolve in a dynamic paradoxical tension. And on this, my Colombian colleagues, Valenzuela and Andrade, have been working, trying to identify how we can categorize these hybrid socio-technical systems. And the other important thing is that socio-technical configurations do not only have problems of environmental unsustainability, but also these configurations reproduce patterns of poverty. So we need to pay attention to both, to the environmental part of these socio-technical configurations and the social part that reproduces patterns of poverty. And because of this, socio-technical changes in the Global South call our attention in relation to justice, because we have winners and losers. And following Mark Swilling, I would like to bring him here, saying that a just transition would consist of a dual commitment to human well-being with respect to income, education, and health, and sustainability with respect to decarbonization, resource efficiency, and ecosystem restoration. So the role of socio-technical innovation in the Global South is not only about becoming more resource efficient, but also about reconfiguring power balance with production and consumption systems. So in other words, in the Global South, socio-technical change, it's an opportunity to alter institutional configurations that protect the privileges of just a few. And I've came across a very interesting paper by Fatoni and his colleagues on rooftop photovoltaic systems in Indonesia, where they make clear how incumbent actors do everything that they can to resist the rooftop photovoltaic system that would benefit most of the people, and in terms of access and in terms of the justice that we're talking about here, but because it challenges the privileges of especially the main companies and the centralized government, the technology is not being has not been adopted like in general terms. It's been already 11 years since the publication of the special issue on socio-technical experiments in Asia, in which the editors discussed if these experiments were a driver for sustainability transitions in the Global South. Since then, we've seen more than 100 papers about different regions in the Global South, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, discussing the topics I've mentioned so far in relation to poverty, in relation to elites, in relation to the lack of counterbalancing power. And it's interesting that we've also seen some of these discussions in places like Canada and Australia, mainly when it refers to regions where there are indigenous communities. And these papers, these studies, have addressed already nearly all societal functions: energy, mobility, urban transitions, agri-food systems, water, both drinking water and sewage systems, waste management, and in general, we've seen topics related to green economy, entrepreneurship, which is really interesting because, and it's also related to the bottom-up that is underneath, is that in the Global South, usually socio-technical change is not driven or incentivized by policy, but from the bottom up, either grassroots movements or entrepreneurs who act also as institutional entrepreneurs. So it's not only about opportunity exploitation, so sustainability as an opportunity for new businesses, but also an opportunity for changing the rules of the game. Inclusive innovation has always been a very important topic, and the achievement of sustainable development goals. In relation to research questions, there have been questions about governance, power, who the actors are, exclusion and inclusion, informality, and there we have also seen deeper discussions related to political economy, to capitalism, to epistemes, and to diverse worldviews. And in general, I would say that all these papers conclude that we need novel conceptual frameworks or expand the conceptual frameworks that we have in sustainability transitions research to be able to uncover the nuances of sustainability transitions in the Global South. So this is what have happened in the last 11 years. So the question is, where are we going now? So taking advantage of the main topic of this conference, I'd like to reflect on what mainstreaming sustainability transitions in the Global South would mean, and to discuss impact in the context of countries like mine. So first, about mainstreaming. I would like to bring Arturo Escobar here, and I'm going to read to you this sentence. We need to step out of existing institutional and epistemic boundaries if we truly want to envision the worlds and practices capable of bringing about the significant transformations seen as needed. This means we need to establish other grounds for thought and action. And basically, this means taking seriously a colonial perspective, which is a decided critique to modernity. And we are already seeing these works in this direction. So for instance, Giuseppe Feola's work on capitalism, where he asks, or where he makes us aware of the capitalist nature of the socio-technical systems that we study. Also, Hopkins and his colleagues, when he responds to the transitions research agenda, and he makes a call for a theoretical pluralization so that scholars can adopt alternative roles, responsibilities, and practices. And a very interesting paper published very recently by a group of Canadian researchers called Unsettling Transitions, representing Indigenous peoples and knowledge in transitions research, where they take very seriously their positionality. So they introduce the paper by being explicit about their positionality as settlers in Canada. But of course, doing this, establishing other grounds for thought and action has great challenges, both theoretical and methodological challenges. So first, we need to embrace the high levels of social complexity that we find in the developing world. And I think if we bring other theoretical and analytical frameworks that come from the critical social sciences, as feminist approaches, post-capitalist, neo-Marxist, and anarchist economy scholars, we can really nurture the frameworks that we usually use, but to be able to really understand this epistemic diversity and this complex institutional context that I've been talking about. These are the authors that have supported me on this theoretical endeavor in my recent work, but this isn't an exhaustive literature review at all. So these social scientists have taken seriously the critique to modernity and have contributed to uncover other grounds for thought. And methodologically, we, social scientists, have been trained on the premise that there is only one sole epistemic tradition from which to achieve truth and universality. So we very often forget that methodological choices respond to epistemological stances. And in these social sciences that we have well trained, we are aligned, of course, to the Western epistemological superiority. So what do I suggest that we do? So I think it's very important to take into account our positionality in research encounters, because the researchers' age, gender, ethnicity, etc., may affect the suitability of particular research methods and therefore its interpretations. And on the other hand, when we are doing experiments, socio-technical experiments, sustainability experiments, or when we are using participatory methods in trying to engage to scholarship, action research, transdisciplinary research, we need to be very aware of whose views prevail. And these two things positionality, and who participates. Even though it may sound a bit obvious, it is very important that we are aware of because of the epistemological superiority. And here I would like to suggest you follow the work of the STEPS Center on methods, and also the work of the Center for Decolonizing Knowledge in Teaching, Research, and Practice from the University of Bath. So these are two centers who are doing work in English in relation to decolonizing methods. So this is about mainstreaming. So I talked about the theoretical and the methodological challenges that we face if we want to find other grounds for thought and action. And in relation to impact. So for me, the main message I would like to say is that we need to be aware that sustainability transitions practice cannot become a new form of colonialism. On the contrary, it's an opportunity to challenge colonialism. And there are already some efforts on this direction. So there's a recent paper by Vipashi and Sarab about the making of a smart city imaginary in Kolkata, where they describe how the policymaking process excludes the views of the groups that don't benefit from an urban digitization process. And they describe how this process happens democratically and transparently. So it is very interesting how it is very clear how this smart city narrative it's a continuation of coloniality, whatever. Sorry, and the work of Unmaking Capitalism by Giuseppe Feola, and I brought here a paper called Unmaking in Sustainability Transformations Beyond Capitalism. Here they describe the peasant movements in Colombia and how these movements foster transformations based on relational ontologies and principles of autonomy, dignity, and sufficiency. And also, I would like to bring the last work of Arturo Escobar on politics for the pluriverse, where he shows how bottom-up initiatives create room for alternative pathways in order to create a pluriverse. A pluriverse is a Zapatist notion of a world where many worlds fit. So it's exactly the opposite of the one world. Another important point in relation to impact, which I think we really need to be aware of, because, well, it's agenda setting, because the agenda is it's created and unconsciously Western questions prevail. So there's also a recent work by Rodrigo Arocena and Judith Sutz about social innovation for global sustainable development as seen from the South. And in that paper, they show how questions that are defined from the South are usually not included in global research consortiums because of the way funding for research is structured at the moment. So being very seriously about whose research questions prevail is important. Another example is the danger of exporting models. And here I would also like to refer to a very recent work by Charmin and his colleagues about bike share programs in Asia, where they present how policies focused on developing bike share programs really overlook the different cultural and the local needs related to using a bike. So that's a very interesting paper in which they reflect on the problem of exporting models. And finally, also in relation to agenda setting, the sort of knowledge that we generate to inform policy. So if we have a broader epistemological background or a broader epistemological way of addressing topics, and we have different ways of different methods to open up epistemes in the South, we can generate knowledge that is really alternative. Otherwise, it is not. Otherwise, it will be the same sort of knowledge that we have created for the last decades. So if we are worried about informing policy, which is a very important topic of this conference, we really need to see how we are generating the knowledge to inform that policy in the Global South. And finally, a very important topic, which there is very little work about, is funding. And following Perez about the fact that the financial system is at the center of driving fundamental economic change, I think it's important we take very seriously the demands to the financial systems that Chantal Naidoo talks about in her paper from last year. In that paper, she doesn't talk about the Global South specifically, but I think it is very important to pay attention to the financial systems in the South and the demands from the Global South to the financial system. So these two topics, or these two avenues for research and for action, are very important to pay attention to if the financial system is at the center of creating change or not, or what sort of change we create. So to sum up, I would like to just to come back to the main points of the presentation. First, I would like to remind you that the Global South is characterized by a complex institutional context and by an epistemic diversity. So doing research that is impactful in the Global South means taking very seriously this complexity and also taking very seriously the ways or the methods which we can use to address that epistemic diversity. And the other message that I really want to leave is that sustainability transitions scholars need to be aware that sustainability transitions cannot become another form of colonialism. And on the contrary, it's an opportunity to challenge colonialism. But to challenge colonialism, we need to be aware of the Western epistemological superiority and establish or work hard on establishing other grounds for thought and action. And of course, it has theoretical and methodological challenges, which are not easy, and we don't know very much how to do this, but there are people who've been working on it, so we can count on them and base our work on them to try to do that. The ways we're going to generate knowledge to inform policy, and the way we're going to address the financial system to create the impact that we want to create in the Global South. So that's it. I'm really looking forward to your reactions, your comments, your questions, and if you later want to discuss further, I'd be happy to hear from you. So this is it, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Monica. And you've certainly stirred my mind with A really wide-ranging talk which raises for me several fundamental issues. The first fundamental issue for me is, as a scientist, what is good science? The second fundamental issue is your topic, which you've called decolonialism, which relates to the first one, also in scientific fields. And the third one, globalization and funding. These are all really fundamental points. We have a couple of questions in the chat, which I will just introduce, which start to talk about these for you. The first question we would like to ask is from Pranushka Kulkarni. As a transitions researcher in the Global South, all I have access to are Western theoretical frameworks to write my thesis. Hard luck. How should I deal with this? Over to you.
Yes, that's one of the main problems. I mean, as I've said, we are well trained in the Western epistemological traditions. I think, there are, in the social sciences, there are many people who've been worked on decolonization and also on epistemic diversity from the 2002 onwards, I would say.
Yeah.
So I had here some of the references to those authors, but we have Grossfogel. Of course, I can recommend Arturo Escobar because he's worked for nearly 4 decades on discussing the problem of modernity. So I recommend you check those authors and then try to make the link. I think more recent literature is easier to understand and to connect to today's literature, like modern literature in the Western, in the West. And also, well, it depends on your research, but for instance, the book on politics for the pluriverse, this is not a research book, it's like an essays book, but Escobar shows how communities, either grassroots movements or indigenous communities or Afro-American communities, create room for transformation. So I would suggest to start referring to them, and feel free to email me, and I can share with you the references that I've used in this presentation today.
Thank you very much, Monica. I think one question that we haven't got in the chat yet and that we haven't really addressed in detail, we maybe can talk about that later, is this question that you alluded to as Western epistemological superiority, or in my rephrasing of it, what is good science for whom? I think that is a fundamental issue that we have, and the very fact that we're talking about papers that are published in journals that we know about and books that we know about show where that bias is. But that's enough from me. The next question that we have is from Abdullah Fahimi in 2 parts, really. But it's about how we regard this whole topic. Do we have an idea of what the Global South is? Is it something that is static? Is it changing? And how can the Global South be defined? How do you think of the Global South? Do you think of the Global South as an entity?
Well, I would say that indeed our countries are different, and indeed we have social configurations that don't exist in the North. And even though it's not very nice to make the difference, it is important to say we are not the same.
Yeah.
And not in terms of like breaking or in terms of dividing, but more in terms of acknowledging what there is inside. So the institutional complexity, I think it's key, because there are, the Western institutions were imposed with colony, and then when our countries went free and independent, all these colonial institutions remained there, but they haven't remained working properly or working well or working well in a sense that everyone benefits from them. So, for instance, we have clientelism. I think that's a very clear institution that works formally and informally in the Global South. And what does it mean, clientelism? When you have clientelism, you have rules that are based on patron-client relationships. So services are given to people not as a right, but as a result of exchange relationship in which creates dependency. Yeah. So that can happen very informally. For instance, when you have taxi drivers in a corner, so you have a patron of that group, and that patron-client relationship is challenged by businesses such as Uber, for instance, or you have patron-client relationships in the government. So you have, for instance, a mayor that's been elected thanks to some favors, and then he has to pay back those favors. So, for instance, clientelism is a very complicated institution that we face in the Global South in general. So when I try to differentiate the Global South from the Global North, I just want to uncover those differences. The other thing that I mentioned about the state that is often co-opted by elites. So I mentioned the example of, for instance, local governments being co-opted by paramilitary groups 20 years ago in Colombia, but at the moment you see that very clearly in relation to economic powers. So economic powers are able to fund political campaigns, and then the person who's elected have to pay back the favors of being elected. So the possibility of co-opting power, the inexistence of power counterbalances are issues that are really important, and are really important in terms of socio-technical change, because when we try to get cleaner technologies, for instance, in our countries, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get more inclusion, more justice, more autonomy, and things like that. So that is the reason why I think it's important to mention it and to be open about the situation that we are not the same. We have very difficult or very complex social situations that we need to face. And when we talk about socio-technical transformations, those social complexities are there, and those changes may benefit some and may undermine the well-being of many in many other situations. So, for instance, in Colombia, we have these incumbent firms talking about a just energy transition, and it's in the narrative always, but nothing is changing for the people. Yeah. So I think it is very important to highlight this and to be open about these problems.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. The next question we have is the idea of crisis, or in the transition language, wicked problems, and therefore the need for a transition. Also an epistemological concept that is rooted in the Western epistemology and modernity. Is this, and I think the underlying idea of this question is this question or this idea of crisis also relevant in countries like yours, what we call the global south?
That's a very difficult question. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't know if crisis is a Western idea, but I could say that our daily lives in this part of the world are quite chaotic in different ways, and so it's not that easy for us to say, okay, everything was stable and nice and easy and everything was working well, and we had a crisis, like the financial crisis some years ago. We don't live that, and I would be happy to hear other people from the Global South in their chat about what they think about what I'm saying. So that idea of being stable and everything working well, and then having a crisis is not that common in our countries. Of course, things can get more difficult sometimes. And when we have, for instance, armed conflict, then the crisis becomes, everything becomes worse. I wouldn't know if crisis is a Western notion, but I would say that stability is something that we don't very often experience in this part of the world.
Right, thank you very much. I think that's a difficult question too. And I think this idea that there is this view in sustainability transitions that there is a stable period, then something goes wrong, and you have an unstable period, and then everything is right again, is underlying our normal notion of transitions, and that's up for debate, I think. So thanks very much for that. The next question is, how do we match up challenging the epistemological supremacy with mainstreaming transitions? Is mainstreaming transitions in that case a contradiction or different?
Well, I think that's exactly my point. We need to be aware what mainstreaming means. So if mainstreaming would mean, for instance, exporting models from Europe to the Global South, which is the example of the paper I talked about in relation to bike share programs, well, we wouldn't like that.
Yeah.
So what we need is to be aware of what are we mainstreaming. And I think that sustainability transitions is an opportunity because we focus on socio-technical configurations, on socio-technical systems. We can open up this and be aware of not overlooking the epistemic diversity I'm talking about and the institutional complexity that I'm talking about. So I think because we're talking about change, of course, this is an opportunity, and this is an opportunity to be inclusive. This is an opportunity to create power counterbalances. This is an opportunity to challenge the power of elites. So from my point of view, it is a great opportunity, but we need to be aware of that in order to make it happen. So when we talk about impact or when we talk about mainstreaming, we don't want to mainstream the incumbents' power, or we don't want to mainstream the exclusive behavior or incumbents or people in power. So there's no problem about mainstreaming. The problem is about not being aware how colonial this mainstreaming could be if we don't pay attention to the institutional context and to the epistemic diversity.
Right. Thank you, Monica. And that leads actually very neatly onto the next question, which is about globalization and its effects, essentially, in my opinion. The question is, can Western sustainability transitions be seen as neo-colonial? For example, when global North actors try to source materials for e-mobility from the global South. And for me, this relates very closely to our Western neoliberal view of what globalization is and global markets and global supply chains. Is this a neo-colonial function, do you think?
Definitely. So, but it doesn't have to be like that. And I think that's the point of my talk here, and the opportunity to be here and to mention all these topics is that if we are aware of the epistemological groundings of our theoretical frameworks, if we are aware of the epistemological groundings of our methodological tools, we can challenge that. And I think it is very important, for instance, in terms of international cooperation. So if sustainability transitions is mainstreamed in European policy, for instance, then of course this will inform international cooperation policy. And then is where it is very important that you researchers from the North are aware of the things I'm talking about here now. Because it doesn't have to be doing transitions in the global South doesn't have to be a neo-colonial way of doing development or doing sustainable development. If we are aware of the things I've talked about, because of course we need change, and we need to promote new social practices and new technologies that are cleaner, because the environmental problem is huge and we need to tackle it now. That's very, very clear. I mean, the climate problems are very clear everywhere, but we need to do it taking into account the institutional complexity and the epistemic diversity that we have in our countries.
Okay, thank you. The next question then also is related to this, from Lucy Oates, and that is, do you think there is value in bringing more social aspects and power issues into the study also of transitions in the global North? And I think for me there is also an important point that goes back to what we've been talking about, epistemological superiority. Why is all the cleverness in the North, and isn't there some cleverness in the South, so to speak, that could also contribute on an equal level? But what do you think?
Yes, definitely. That's a great point. It's not only about the South. It's only about how things are done in the North. So why do we prioritize smart over more simple or frugal innovations? Mm-hmm. Why do we do that? Why do you think that smart is better than frugal? So indeed, that's very, very important. That's a great point. So thank you for bringing it to the table.
Okay. And the next question is, how important is it to understand transitions, their definitions and meanings, in context? And you've talked a little bit about Colombia, where you could argue that maybe transition relates to peace. Is that a particular aspect in Colombia, or is that an issue of peace as opposed to contest more generally in the global South?
Well, yes. Context is key, and I think geographers are trying to do a very good work contributing to sustainability transitions frameworks. The case of peace, well, I would say is basic. Without peace, anything makes sense. So you can try to do so many things, cleaner, more inclusive, whatever. But I mean, of course, peace is like a needed underlying state to be able to have well-being for everyone.
Yeah.
But peace, I mean, not peace, is fueled by the things I've also mentioned. So when we have a political power that is co-opted by an economic power, and what matters is making money and growing economically, then other things are not prioritized in the public agenda. So, so it's not disconnected. It's very much connected. The way we reproduce patterns of exclusion, the way we protect the privileges of elites, of course, that doesn't create peace. So if we use socio-technical change, for instance, in relation, I don't know, to energy. So we have a region in the north with lots of potential for photovoltaic energy. But if we are not paying attention to the situation of the communities who live there, and I'm not talking about the ecological problems of creating large fields of solar panels there. Of course, we are not creating peace. So the socio-technical configuration can either create peace or create more conflict.
Right. Thank you very much. That's a good point. The next question we have is from Bruno Thornheim. What can a Global South perspective bring to three dualisms that he mentions? Stability and change, incumbent and challenger, and core and periphery. So these are ideas that are central to transitions frameworks, but do they have a different meaning or perspective from the Global South?
Well, that's, well, I think we could talk a lot about that, but in terms of stability and change. I think what the Global South can bring to the Global North in terms of transition studies is the possibility to see diversity. So I think the Global South brings diversity because we have all sorts of hybrid socio-technical configurations where you don't have like those duality that you were talking about. So we have like continuums. So some socio-technical configurations are more stable than others. But we don't have stable and not stable. So or longer terms of stability and shorter terms of stability. So it's much less about like two stages. It's much more about like a continuum. And in the Global South, that's very clear. So it's evident. So in terms of stability and change, we don't see stability very often. But of course, we do need change. So maybe change is not, in this case, is not the opposite of stability. Is that another pathway, maybe, or something like that. In terms of incumbents and not incumbents. So it's the same, because it's not like single socio-technical configurations, but a mixture of many socio-technical configurations that coexist. Incumbents may not be that powerful, or they are very powerful in that specific regime. So for instance, in terms of food, so we have powerful incumbent actors, which are global, the same as in many countries, but there are many other actors who are also in the food system, but they just coexist. So when we talk about incumbent actors, it's not just a single group of incumbent actors. It's like in these socio-technical configurations, these are the incumbents, and these are the less powerful. But in the other one, which coexist and is just living simultaneously and evolving simultaneously, you have other incumbents. So it's not that incumbents are not powerful, it's that you have many different groups of powerful actors. And with different ways of showing their power. So you can have formal ways. So you have formal lobbying, for instance, which exists everywhere. But you can also have, I don't know, more informal or illegal ways of exercising power. And those coexist. And the same actor can deploy both strategies. So I think it's more in terms of diversity. So those dualities that you're mentioning about are not so clear. They are like more, I don't know, diverse or diffused or
a continuum maybe, or
Exactly. And the same in terms of the core and the periphery. Because, for instance, in our cities, we have centers which work exactly as in the north, and people who live in bubbles which look exactly the same as living in a city in the north, but you have other parts that are not like that. So you have the core and the periphery like very close, coexisting very closely, and all actors move one to the other one like very easily. So I don't know. I think that's what I would say about that question.
Right.
Hope it helps something.
Great. Thanks very much, Monica. So I think that's a very important point. It is that we tend to simplify, and that what the global South perspective, if you want to call it that, brings us is this spectrum, this whole spectrum of different situations, contexts, structures. Flor Avellino has also got a question in this direction a bit, in particular with relating institutional perspectives to transitions. What is the relation between a well and a not so well or ill-functioning institution? Is there a connection with formal and informal institutions? And you can see how this duality thinking is already there once and again that we can maybe pick apart. But how do institutions and institutional perspectives operate in the global South?
Okay. Well, I think well-functioning and ill-functioning is not related to formality and informality. You can have formal institutions that don't function well in terms of creating or expanding human capability, and you have informal institutions that do, that function well. So I think those are like two different dimensions. I mean, not for being informal, it will function at all. And I think that's a very, very important topic, and I thank you for bringing it here, because very often, especially, I mean, for instance, when we talk about international cooperation projects, it is very important to formalize. So formalize is a need. And it is not actually, because in informality, you have lots of social richness. It might be messy or difficult to read and impossible to track, for instance, in terms of taxes or whatever. So it is, I mean, that's a problem, but it has lots of social richness, and it creates lots of social networks and like a very strong, a very strong social network. So informality is not bad at all. I mean, informality is not a synonym of ill-functioning institutions. What is the problem of ill-functioning and of ill-functioning institutions? The problem is especially when they are formal, is that undermine the well-being of many, but it doesn't seem to be like that. So when you have formal institutions that are ill-functioning, from my point of view, you create more vulnerability. So you have, let me think of an example. I don't know, in relation to water management.
Right.
And you are supposed to have formal institutions that are taking care of the, I forgot the word in English.
Of the water supply.
Exactly, of the watershed. So it exists formally, and you can, and yes, and it formally exists, and it's regulated, and it's created by a decree. And you have people who've been elected to do that job, or have been appointed to that, but they are not doing anything.
Yeah.
So it's like a facade institution. So it's like a symbolic institution. So I think that's even worse, because we are supposed to have a formal institution doing some job that is important for maintaining all the, I mean, not also the water, but also the ecosystem at the site and everything. I'm sorry, I forgot the words in English for that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't exist. So everyone is worse off afterwards.
Right.
So I think it's not a problem of formality and informality, and I would dare to say that it's even worse when you have formal institutions that are ill-functioning.
Right.
So I don't know, Flor, if I replied to your questions with that.
But thank you for that discussion. Yeah. So going back to our discussions on epistemology and how we do our science, do you think it is possible to create spaces in our methods for multiple epistemologies? If there are different ways of knowing, how can we adapt our methods to account for different ways of knowing? For me, that is a question, because your method is based upon your epistemology. But how would you cope or suggest that people cope with multiple epistemologies?
Well, it's a challenge, because we are not used to doing that, and this is new, and we are very well trained in the modern epistemology. So it's difficult to move away from it, because we are very well trained on it, and we've lived on it for many, many years. But for instance, in my case, we are using games, and that's really interesting. It's because when you are playing, and when you doing qualitative research, of course. When you play, it's very easy to see how different things emerge. So playing it's very, very interesting. I've also seen people who are using metaphors as the basis of our research process. So, for instance, it could be the metaphor of a plant. So you have a seed, and then when you have the first two leaves, and how everything evolves. Also, I don't know, the butterfly before it is butterfly. I don't know the word in English for that. So using metaphors is also like organic metaphors. It's also an interesting way of moving away from like more logocentric methods. And I think, well, the work that the centers I suggested, STEPS in Sussex and the other center in Bath, they are experimenting with different methods and reflecting on how we can open up, or how can we not close the filter for alternative epistemes different from the modern one?
Right.
So I think it is a challenge, and I think it implies lots of experimenting, but just being aware that our methodological choices are grounded on epistemological choices, that's already a lot, because usually we just take it for granted, and we just do it as it is supposed to be done. So I think that's just a very good starting point.
Right. Thank you for that. And the next question that we have is from Hannah Paris. Reconfiguring power seems critical to marginalized communities in the North. Do you think that the issues that you raised around marginalization apply to transition study more generally, as well as to explicitly in these communities in the Global South, I guess?
Yes, I think it applies more generally. And for instance, people who are working on the growth, they have very clear that it is important to challenge challenge modernity. It is key to challenge modernity. And in terms of of vulnerable communities and shifting power also in the North, well, I think it is related. It is not my expertise, but the situations that marginalized communities live in the North, either because they are migrants or because they are indigenous, well, are very related to the topics I've been talking here. So it's a way of systematically neglecting other worldviews and other, basically other worldviews.
Right.
But this is a bit different because they are, these indigenous communities or these marginalized communities that are immigrants are embedded in northern institutional contexts. And I'm not expert on that. But I think it is important to learn. And for example, the paper I mentioned, that it's a group of Canadian researchers making explicit that they come from families who are white settlers, and how they start just making very evident their positionality is really interesting. And it's a way of saying, okay, we have problems that are more common and they are more easy to see in the South, but we also have these pockets in the North too. So I think you could generalize it a bit more, or you can use it for these pockets that are in the North.
Right, thank you. The next question is, institutional contexts and their stability differ in the global South and the global North. Many sustainability transitions concepts are built around institutional rigidity and the regime. Are these concepts of rigidity useful in the global South contexts?
Well, I think this is similar to what we were discussing about the opposites. So, for instance, if we think of, a centralized socio-technical system, for instance, energy. So you have grid connections, and you have like a central system, and for instance, at the moment, because of neoliberal practices, there are private actors investing in these facilities, and sometimes the state is also an investor. So, and on those configurations, you do find lots of rigidity. But that's not the only configuration. There are other configurations that might be more flexible. and those other configurations are providing with energy, like in this example, to other communities in different ways.
Yeah.
So I think rigidity is a useful concept because in our countries we do have like rigid socio-technical regimes, but they are not the only ones. They are existing there together with others that maybe in other regions or covering other populations in the same city. So I think it's not a matter of not using the concept at all. It's just saying that for this specific socio-technical regime, we can use this concept, but maybe for a very informal provision of energy, rigidity is not a useful concept.
Right. Okay. The next question that we have is about methodology. What research methods are suitable for transitions in Global South research? Are there any methods that are not suitable?
That's a difficult question to answer like in a straightforward way.
Yeah.
But I think, it depends very much on what you're trying to do and the sort of actors you're trying to involve. So if you're doing participatory research, so it is very important to be aware of whose voices prevail and to be very sensitive to, for instance, when you notice that when this actor comes, the dynamics are very different from when that other actor comes, or things like that. When you count on a local partner to bring a group of people together, who that partner is connected with. So it's very different if you are counting on a policy maker that works in a public organization. And that's very different from having a partner that works with an international NGO, which is very different from a partner who works on a local NGO, which is very different from a partner who works at a university. And it's also different if it's a public university or a private university. And because this thing about positionality is so important, it is very important to be aware of that. So you can't just say, no, my local partner, and just imagine that everything will be smooth because you have a local partner. That local partner has a positionality too. And it's different if you come from the capital city or if you come from another city. And my point is, it is complex. and we need to be aware of those complexities. It's not, we are not doing good science, as Jonathan has been saying, when we try to simplify. Right. So it's very different when you are an international, a donor, like international cooperation. So it's very important to be aware of that. Right. And it's very different if you are a woman or if you are a man or things like that. So just be very cautious of all the thoughts that I've mentioned here about positionality and about who participates. And there are some methods that are really, that privilege the participation of more eloquent people. So for instance, people who are more educated are more able to participate in certain methods. Maybe if you hear other voices, maybe you can use games or you can use art. For instance, both in playing and in doing art, everyone is more equal, different from a more logocentric workshop or focus group or something like that. I think just try not to simplify and try to grasp all the complexity that can be found like in our contexts.
Right. And for me, as somebody who does quite a lot of simulation modeling of transitions and the use of formal models which inevitably involve a high level of simplification, therefore bring, I think, for the Global South, a lot of challenges. One issue that occurred to me when you were talking, Monica, is that of data. A very simple question: is there data for you to calibrate your computer model? And a lot of work on climate science and sustainability depends on having time series of data collected in a quite different way, but in a standardized way so that you can look at it back at the history. And so I think that's, I wouldn't say that a formal numerical method is not suitable for any situation in the Global South, but I think you do have to consider these issues of what is suitable and what data you have and what knowledge you have about the variation to make your model appropriate, let's put it that way. That's my personal opinion there. Yeah.
Exactly, yes, that's a great point. Because, of course, quantitative methods simplify a lot.
Yeah.
So if you look, yes, simplify a lot. And that's useful for many things, and it's important, and it informs policy in diverse ways. What is important about quantitative researchers is that they don't forget that there's lots of detail and richness behind those figures.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing. And the other thing, I've came across some work very much related to environmental conservation. Mm-hmm. I mean, not in transitions, more like like environmental conservation based on communities, ownerships, and things like that. And they are doing interesting qualitative methods based on games to define the rules of the model. So before doing the model, the computational model, they play for a long time, and it's a game, and it's physical, and it's not digital, it's real, and they play several times, several iterations. So there's lots of room for observing informal rules, for observing differences between gender, age, ethnicity. But first is based on games and lots of iterations. And when that is like more clear, then you can go to the computer and do the model. Right. And I think that's a very interesting way to systematize complexity.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Monica. Where's the next question? We've got a few minutes left, so room for 2 or 3 more, I think. From Juan Gazon, promoting horizontal inter-epistemic dialogues may be impossible in regimes where the differences are incommensurable. I think social regimes are meant there. Is it therefore possible that justice, in whatever one means by that, can emerge in transitions where these regimes are fundamentally different to the alternatives?
Yes, sometimes those different socio-technical configurations that coexist in conflicting terms. Yeah. So I think it's a very good question to say, would there be room for justice at any time? And I would say there has to be room for justice. We have to figure out the way to make it work. But it is difficult when we have this, when we don't have power counterbalance, and when, for instance, states, which are the ones who are supposed to be responsible for protecting the rights of everyone, are co-opted by other interests, which might be economic or whatever interests. It's really complicated. So it's really complicated to bring that conflicting situation into peaceful coexistence. So I think here issues of social innovation, of transformative social innovation, are very, very important. The way social innovators can make room for bypassing these powerful actors is very important. So I think that's like a tool that we have already in the transitions scholarship. So I think, we need to pay attention to that. But it's not easy. And I really understand your question. And sometimes you see like, no, that's it. I mean, it doesn't have any positive future. And I've seen that. And I know exactly what you mean with your question. But I think we need to keep working, and we need to keep finding ways. And usually grassroots leaders are amazing in bypassing obstacles and connecting resources from very different places. So I think, in the end, it has to be possible.
Right. And I think that's also a way where your last point about grassroots, which is, of course, comes back to the fundamental ideas of transitions, is a way of allowing for all this diversity in your methods and what you do. We've only got a few more minutes, and I think we've had a fantastic and very long question and answer session. I'm just going to mention one final point which we haven't discussed so far, and which hasn't come up in the questions, but I think is also a big gap in what we do, and that is the gap of funding. How do you see the financial systems that we have in the global north, but also systems that we have in the global south, insofar as they are different, or if they are different, contributing to a process of socio-technical change?
Yeah, that's a huge topic, and it's very new, so there's very little research on this, but it is very important. I think here it is important, on the one hand, to take into account the social and solidarity economy. So there's I know in Latin America this is big. So you have like financial organizations in the social and solidarity sector who are doing lots of interesting things in terms of sustainability. I wouldn't know specifically in relation to socio-technical change, but in terms of sustainability, like in more general terms. And this topic is neglected in the discussion. So I think it's important to look at it and study it and bring evidence to the table, to the discussion. So that's one thing. And the other thing, because of all of this, I mean, this Addis Ababa agreement to fund the Sustainable Development Goals and all the movement of impact investing, it's creating lots of room for sustainability transitions, and I mean, what we are observing is that you see many things. So you see like conventional investors who just want to minimize their risk, so that government have to guarantee that risk is very, very low, and then it reproduces many patterns of dependency and things like that. Because the more certain you want to be, the less change you need. So I think that doesn't help a lot. Yeah. But there are also financial groups that are being more experimental, and also financial policies are being experimental. So I think there's room. And of course, I don't know. I mean, it's been very little studied, so I wouldn't be able to bring research results here. Yeah. But I think there's room for studying different financial configurations. So you have bonds, and you have like green bonds, social bonds, impact investing. You have biodiversity credits, carbon credits. There are many products,
instruments,
and instruments, exactly. Thank you. That I think that may create interesting room for doing interesting things, but well, we need to follow them and to study them, and I think it's also important to inform them well. So I'm coming back to my point in my presentation about knowledge generation. Yeah. If we want to challenge institutional practices that reproduce the power of elites, we need to bring evidence of that, and we need to inform investors well. Yeah. And we need to bring evidence of what's really going on. So I think that's a very, very interesting topic, the finances for sustainability, and specifically in terms of socio-technical change. It is really, well, I think there's lots of room. So I would say that's a very important topic for the next 5 years.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we've come to the end now. I would just like to thank you, Monica, and on behalf of everybody in the conference, I'm going to applaud you. So that's a visual round, remote round of applause, hopefully. But I think it's great, and I think we've covered a really broad range of topics. We've opened up new research questions, or at least made clear some that aren't well followed. So thanks very much for that. And I look forward to seeing you, hopefully, at some point in the near future, as well as in the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. And now's the break time. See you soon again.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to all the audience for the great questions and conversation.